André Rieu is regarded as the most vibrant and dynamic musician of our time. He is a man, a myth, and a legend. Watch as he ultimately draws his final breath, betraying the confidence of all his fans. The notion that music never dies was the foundation of André Rieu's entire career. He transformed waltzes from being confined to historic Vienna halls to feeling like an anthem for common people. He vowed for decades that his orchestra would perform everywhere in the world. However, the promise fell apart when he got to Mexico in 2024. After 2 performances, he became ill, and 4 more concerts were postponed. The venues were deserted, leaving thousands of followers who had traveled for years to see him. There were no answers for the world. There was quiet. Illness was the only word in the production statement. It didn't explain why one of the most devoted performers in the world abruptly stopped. The orchestra's manager, his son Pierre, had to deal with irate patrons and disgruntled promoters. People wanted to know if this was the end. Something darker was nourished by that quiet. His disappearance was announced on social media. False death notices proliferate. Fan pages and hashtags greeted it as a farewell within hours. He had previously been interrupted by illness. He became disoriented and lost his ability to perform in 2010 due to a viral infection of the vestibular nerve. Later on, he called it the darkest period of his life. All around Europe, concerts were cancelled. He acknowledged that he believed he might never come back after being bedridden for weeks. Comparisons were made right away by fans who recalled that catastrophe. Did history repeat itself? The public was only partially informed about the details for the cancellation in Mexico. Some members of the orchestra were having trouble breathing due to the city's elevation. They were literally out of breath. One of his singers, Donna Alberti, claimed that she had to pause during rehearsal due to nosebleeds and difficulty breathing. Members of the crew talked about being tired. More catastrophic problems, such as pneumonia or a secret cardiac condition, were rumored. None were verified. There was no doubt that the damage this time extended beyond a single night. Pierre acknowledged that they had to refund about 40,000 tickets and send home roughly 125 crew members. The emotional toll was greater than the financial one. André acknowledged that he was shaken. "I can't begin a tour like this again," he stated. In an industry where most careers were already terminated by age, he was 74 years old. Once seemingly unstoppable, the orchestra was now stopped. It felt final to the crowd. Mexico City's silence was compared to a funeral. There was no curtain call, no music, just a grief-filled emptiness. The contrast was what increased the sting of this. Only a few days prior, André had entered on stage with a smile, a bow, and a promise of more joyful evenings. The same fans were now silently watching his team load trucks and roll up cables. The change was too abrupt. The talk of death grew in that silence. It was a cultural farewell to the thing that defined them, not a formal death or a medical confirmation. André's past lends credence to these rumors. Doctors cautioned him about stress and lengthy travels following the sickness in 2010. He disregarded suggestions of slowing down at the moment. He joked that he would perform till 140, but this time, he acknowledged that the body was winning. He informed the Mexican media that he needed to pay more attention to himself. It sounded like a retirement speech, but it wasn't. This is no incident involving the orchestra. His family is involved. In 2016, André had to postpone the event as one member passed out in Nottingham due to a heart attack. The health of the orchestra was more important than the ire of the audience, he stated. Fans worried not just the loss of concerts, but also the end of an era. And that phrase now comes back as a foreshadowing. What future is left if the orchestra is family and the leader is frail? André transformed his performances into elaborate musicals that needed months of rehearsal, special stages, and leased aircraft. He can't be replaced by many musicians because to their lack of scale and discipline. Concerts aren't the only thing his disease halts. It puts the Johann Strauss Orchestra's continued existence as a touring act in jeopardy. That explains why humans grieve so rapidly. André wasn't the only thing on their minds. Everything associated with his name was on their minds. The burden was now Pierre's. He became the spokesperson for press conferences, refunds, and logistics. There were two meanings in his words. He sounded confident when he said, "The orchestra must go on." Others heard a fatherless son getting ready to take over. This is the starting weight. Although André Rieu didn't pass away in Mexico, the country's silence led many to assume that he had. The rumor of his death spread more quickly than the facts for days, and something did die that night in a sense. The notion that there would be no repercussions if André continued to play. Mexico was where that myth came to an end. Rest assured, we shall enter fully later. Music had been the foundation of his enterprise. It was never just his though. André Rieu transformed performances into universes, which is why the Johann Strauss Orchestra, the Dresses, and the Waltz all worked. But there were cracks behind the sparkle. The seemingly indestructible orchestra had survived storms that almost destroyed it. The musicians left. Financial strain caused tours to fail, and the Rieu family repeatedly questioned whether the empire would just disappear overnight. Pierre viewed it all as the son who had to bear the burden and the victory, rather than as a fan. The 2008 financial crisis was when the fissures became most obvious. André continued touring and investing millions in stage while others tightened their belts. It almost destroyed him. There were cancellations. As bankruptcy rumors began to circulate, the Waltz King was unexpectedly vulnerable. His music was insufficient to stop the headlines for the first time. Pierre saw this as a practice run for the future, because you learn early on that one collapse inevitably threatens the other when your father is both a man and a brand. Money wasn't the only factor. Health also stepped in. André was unable to perform for months in 2010 due to a viral virus. Supporters murmured over his death. His career was pronounced over by headlines. Nevertheless, he returned with his bow in hand as like nothing had occurred. However, Pierre recalled the quiet of that Maastricht home, the postponed practice sessions, and the fearful yet defiant expression in his father's eyes. At that moment, he realized that although a man's death and his music's death might not occur simultaneously, they would experience the same emotions. The orchestra was also plagued by that quiet. Members who had known André for decades started to wonder what would happen if he left. Who would take the lead? Without its founder, would the orchestra be able to survive, or would it fall apart like an hairless dynasty? Pierre understood the murmurs were about more than succession each time he heard them. They dealt with the frailty of his father. None of them dared to say it in public though. At least on stage, the immortality myth had to go on. That myth was perpetuated by André himself. He continued to create tours that seemed to beyond human endurance. Fireworks-filled stadiums, dramatic staging, and never-ending travel. However, the physical, financial, and emotional costs increased along with the popularity of his music. According to friends, his obsession with details drove him to weariness, as though managing the spectacle would postpone the inevitable. For Pierre, however, it was clear. The empire became increasingly brittle as it expanded in size. Everything may fall apart with only one mistake or one season that was cancelled. Pierre hardly ever talked about another tension. His dad was more than just a musician. In addition, he was a precise ruler and businessman. His subordinates were aware that the maestro's friendliness on stage could be transformed into unrelenting perfectionism behind the scenes. They practiced till the sun came up. Errors were penalized. The standards were harsh. The orchestra became brittle, but it also became perfect. Pierre witnessed the same unrelenting spirit that fueled his father's progress, but also wore him down. Music took precedence over everything, including in their personal lives. Tours had to be arranged around family gatherings, holidays, and even mourning. Pierre has acknowledged it. As a child, he occasionally hoped his father would slow down or perhaps stop, but there was never any stopping. André believed that slowing down signified acknowledging that the waltz were over. As a result, the family's life revolved around frequent departures and arrivals, a beat that obscured what was really going on. The music on which his father had founded his legacy was gradually taking over his life. Pierre accomplished something that fans were unaware of. Since that infection, the maestro's health had fluctuated several times, forcing tough decisions each time, always concealed under eye-catching performances. The guy they loved was engaged in combat that his viewers never witnessed. As the world continued to dance, his son calculated the prices and waited for the moment when the hush would last forever. Pierre, however, was also aware of something that the supporters were not. It would be more than just a man's death when that time came. A music, a world, or a way of life would all perish, and telling it was his responsibility. The world believed André Rieu's empire was unstoppable, a utopian machine powered by unending acclaim and waltzes. Pierre, however, was aware of the reality. It had come close to collapsing before, and each time it did, it was weaker and more brittle, like porcelain that had been glued together, but it was constantly in danger of shattering again. 2011 was the tipping point. A year after his viral ailment had rendered him silent, André hastily pulled himself back onto the stage. Behind the curtain, he was barely hanging on, despite the brilliant concerts and the rapturous praise. Pierre eventually acknowledged that his family was afraid for his life, as well as his career. The orchestra was rocked by the stress of returning from illness. Audiences started to whisper that the king of the waltz was waning, cancellations were piling up, and expenses were rising. The empire had never been this close to collapsing. It was like a plane in free fall for the symphony. The safety of the landing was unknown. Crew members updated their resumes in secret. Some long-standing musicians quit completely because they didn't want to risk their livelihoods on a potentially doomed ambition. Pierre viewed each desertion as evidence that the magic could disappear at any time rather than as a sign of treachery. His father grinned at the public. He struggled at home with the question that no artist ever wants to answer. Had he perished before the music? The financial strain was severe. Millions were spent on each cancelled show. Additionally, the empire barely survived on ticket sales and sponsorships as production costs skyrocketed. André had always demanded opulence. Cathedrals were converted into performance spaces. Fireworks performed in time with Strauss. Sweeping video recordings that gave the symphony an air of invincibility. However, grandeur came at a cost. At one point, there were speculations that if debts couldn't be paid off, the family house itself may be in danger. Pierre never disputed it, but he also never confirmed it, and his remarks were overshadowed by his silence. Pierre's function changed throughout this period. The son was no longer the only one observing from the sidelines. He was compelled to convert art into survival and took on the roles of manager and guardian. In addition to calming nervous investors and negotiating with promoters, he also protected his father from the most unpleasant aspects. Although he played down the difficulties in interviews, he was responsible for keeping the music and the personality alive beneath the mask. His father's decades-long legacy would come to an end if he failed, not with cheers, but in quiet. André's face reflected the tension. Fans noticed the weariness for the first time. Regarding his age, critics speculated that he might resign. Each tour cancellation was interpreted as a sign that the end was imminent, but he wouldn't back down. He kept going back to the stage with his bow in hand, even when doctors told him to rest, as though every performance was evidence that he had once again escaped death. It wasn't courage to Pierre, it was fixation. His father was battling more than simply sickness. He was battling time itself, and there were repercussions for that preoccupation. Subtle cracks appeared in the orchestra. In the wake of André, musicians discussed leadership. Would Pierre step in? Would anyone be able to duplicate the maestro's presence? The orchestra was adored by the crowd, but they came for him. The empire was simply a bunch of musicians without him. Both Pierre and they were aware of it. The man wasn't the only one in danger. The music itself was the cause. Then there was stillness. Several tours had to be cancelled in 2016 due to another health issue. Although the family kept quiet and the details were hazy, insiders said it was a time when André had to face his mortality. The announcement appeared straightforward to the public. Cancelled performances because of illness. It was something darker to those who knew him, a reminder that his body was no longer unbeatable. Supporters pleaded for further information. Online rumors circulated that he had either died or surreptitiously retired. The reality was more nuanced. If only momentarily, the music had ceased, and during that silence the illusion of immortality broke open. Pierre was scarred by that delay. Even though he was still alive, he had seen audiences weep as though the world had already lost him. It served as a sneak peek into the response on the day the silence was enforced. Because he understood something that other people didn't, it frightened him. The loss will be felt not just as the passing of a man, but also as the passing of a whole musical period when his father's bow eventually fell. The world wasn't prepared to hear it though. The fantasy was adhered to by fans. Reporters sought assurances, and André continued to make more promises. Pierre, however, was aware of the reality. Piece by piece, tour by tour, silence by stillness, the music was already dying, and before long, he would have to say goodbye, something no son ever wants to do. It started out as a rumor and quickly gained momentum. Rieu André was dead. In forums, fans left homages, online strangers lamented, and media outlets rushed to confirm. Although there had been previous rumors that he was going to die, this one was more significant because it was accompanied by quiet. The orchestra made no announcements right away. The absence of Pierre himself fueled conjecture that the worst had finally occurred. Since the truth was already partially anticipated, many people found it to be real. Before the curtain comes down, how many times can a man resist fatigue, disease, and collapse? As if the story were true, tributes flooded in. Resurfaced were clips from his gigs. Admirers recalled weddings, first dances, and times when his waltzes brought happiness into their lives. His music had been the soundtrack to the best recollections of entire generations. The loss of something really personal was what it would be like to imagine it gone. Even though the facts weren't true, the anguish was real. And for Pierre, it felt like he was seeing a practice run for the inevitable. The adjustment, however, followed. André remained alive. His death was not the tragedy. It was something more subdued, more difficult to describe, yet equally powerful. The music itself has been dying piece by piece. Every cancelled show, every break in tour schedule, and every physical strain he endured represented not just a man's decline, but also the disintegration of the universe he had created. Though his dominion no longer bore the same immortality, the Waltz King had not permanently left the stage. Fans were lamenting the disappearance of the music they loved, a reality they were still unable to acknowledge. Pierre eventually addressed it in a way that demonstrated what the public had long feared, not in a spectacular news release or drama. He talked about the tension, the fragility, and the price his father had paid to maintain the illusion. He acknowledged what insiders knew but fans didn't want to hear. The orchestral empire couldn't continue indefinitely, and when silence finally came, it would take the music with it along with the man. It was a question of when, not if. It was cruelly ironic. André had dedicated his life to bringing waltz back to life, persuading millions that a century-old musical style was still relevant today. By wrapping nostalgia in gowns and pyrotechnics, he transformed Strauss into a stadium show. However, he had tied his own existence to a genre that would not be able to function without him. André's work lacked air. Unlike rock bands or orchestras with revolving conductors, Pierre knew better than anyone, yet he could run the company. One man's bow was the home of the magic. The sound perished without it. Fans were grieving even during his lifetime because of this. They felt death in bits and pieces every time the stage went dark, in the silences, in the pauses, in the diminishing tours. Tragically, André Rieu had not abandoned them permanently. The reason was that they were already losing him gradually and unrelentingly over time, and Pierre, more than anyone else, had to see as the world practiced its sorrow beforehand. He once acknowledged that one day MRI would become quiet, and the yearly sight of waltz performed outside in the summer would disappear, leaving just recollections. He didn't present it as a retirement or the cancellation of a show. He referred to it as the death of music, and he bore the responsibility of getting the world ready for it. Was it the end, though? He is still on the road, as some of you may have surmised. The unfortunate twist is that André Rieu was already setting up his stage for something bigger, even as his admirers mourn his passing. Not a quiet conclusion, but a farewell so raucous and dramatic that it would seem as though death itself were being celebrated. For the Waltz King will not disappear in silence. He intends to make a spectacular exit. He has the evidence on his calendar. His name will continue to appear on posters around Europe, the Middle East, and other regions this year and next. October saw Abu Dhabi, followed shortly by Cologne and Frankfurt, Budapest, Austria, Romania. Then Rig, his house, his stage, his cathedral, as if fate had called for it. They are not hiding the man they believe to be dead. He is working towards something that only he could have dreamed of, a series of concerts that serves as his farewell. It won't be subtle either. He's never been nuanced. Fireworks, heavenly lit cathedrals, and gold-dressed orchestras. He established his empire in this manner, and he will continue to do so. Every show on this tour feels more like a new chapter in a requiem than a new date. One more great story, played on violins instead of words. Pierre has already alluded to his father's lack of understanding of moderation. It wouldn't be a retirement celebration if André planned his own departure. It would be a phony funeral masquerading as a show. Mastery would be his last farewell. The square is filled with choirs. It sounds like a cathedral outside, with voices layered over violins. His orchestra swells with history rather than sound. Each note bears the burden of decades. Then, there was stillness. The one time when the lights go out. The audience waits in anticipation of his return as the bow is lowered. However, he doesn't. There was no curtain call or encore, just gloom, like though the music had vanished before their own eyes. He has been practicing that conclusion all along. Death as performance, not as a silent passing away or as death in a hospital bed. Dramatic, rebellious, and unforgettable.